be alive in this land of ours. Good to drive in this land of ours.
Hello, Canada hockey fans in the United States.
Welcome back to Hockey Time Machine, everybody. A quick word that it was so nice to meet several of you a couple of weeks back here in Toronto. Hockey certainly creates communities, and it was really nice to see that community, the Hockey Time Machine community, come together and enjoy some camaraderie, some hockey, some meals, some drinks, and go from there. So thank you for those who were able to come up and join us, and I hope others will consider for another time if we can. We had a wonderful time then, and we're going to have a wonderful time tonight, too. Want to thank, as always, our creators of this podcast, Paul Patskow and Laura Evans, and who created it back 18 months ago, or even more so when you think about it, when COVID reared its ugly head. And we really are appreciative of all the things that have come to pass during that time. Today's Hockey Time Machine brought to you by Soho Table Hockey. And I also want to thank Glenn Dreyfus, who is so good behind the controls, the unheralded role on Hockey Time Machine. Well, it's that special time of year. It's Hanukkah, Kwanzaa, Christmas, as well as new hockey book season. It's a real special time for me. And if you're like me, rubbing your hands together, hoping that maybe when Santa comes, drops down, there might be a hockey book or three under the Christmas tree this year. And speaking of three, we're going to highlight three really fantastic hockey books, very, very different books, along with their authors this evening. You're going to learn about a family that has sent 4 generations, not just to the NHL, but to one legendary franchise when we talk to Danny Jeffrion and his co-author, Paul Deepan. We'll find out about planes, trains, and automobiles, but in the hockey variety when we speak with Tim Falconer. And to start off, we're going to talk to a man whose dream was to play in the National Hockey League, but discovered that playing professional wasn't all that he had necessarily hoped it would be, and his name is Bernie Saunders. And I welcome Bernie Saunders, first of all, to Hockey Time Machine. Really nice to have you here, Bernie.
Thank you for having me.
So as I understand, you were born in Montreal, but reading your bio, it was interesting to see that you spent time in Ajax, Ontario. Not that anybody else out there cares, but I do, because that's where I live, and that's where I'm broadcasting from today, or podcasting, or whatever you want to say it. I want to talk a little bit about that in a moment's time, too. In fact, let's talk about that. Let's talk about you and your brother, John, who many of us in the Toronto area are going to remember from City TV in the early 1980s, and then went on to such a terrific career on ESPN and ABC, and did play-by-play for the Toronto Raptors for a period of time, too. The two of you played hockey together, first of all, in Chateauguay. Can you tell us a little bit about that experience, Bernie?
Well, it's a typical Canadian story. You know, some people ask, why does a black play hockey? And the simple answer is we were Canadians. We lived in Montreal. I was born right in Montreal in NDG. And of course, what did we do? We watched Hockey Night in Canada like every other kid and aspired to play for the Toronto Maple Leafs or the Montreal Canadiens. And so both John and I just grew up with a kind of Canadian mentality. I'm sure if we lived in the States, we would have played other sports, but being Canadians, we just wanted to play hockey and skate in the NHL.
Well, so to that end, just like so many of us, did you have a favorite hockey player at the time, or someone that you fashioned your game after, especially maybe when you're playing road hockey as much as when you were on the ice?
That is a loaded question for me because I talk about it a lot in my book. I patented my game around Guy Lafleur. Yeah. Back in those days, number 10 for the Montreal Canadiens, he would go flying down that right wing. He'd gather in the puck just outside the blue line, take a few strides, and whip a slap shot to the opposite goal post. And the Bleu Blanc Rouge celebrated another goal. that's all I wanted to do. And I was kind of a sports nerd. I wasn't into books, and I didn't have girlfriends and everything like that. So I was always off someplace working on my patented play, like Guy Lafleur, and was successful with it. You know, it was one of my patented plays when I played college, and I also used it in the pros.
Just before we step into the college career, which was so sensational, let's talk a little bit about playing junior B hockey with the Pickering Panthers in the mid-'70s, right here in the Ajax area. As you mentioned, that was the first time that you'd really encountered any racial epithets. And maybe you can tell me a little bit about that, if you don't mind, Bernie.
Well, it definitely wasn't the first time. I encountered several problems playing junior B, but for John and I, it really started younger as soon as we started playing travel hockey. But when I made it to Pickering, what happened was I played in Chateauguay junior B with the Chateauguay Wings. Jacques Demers was actually the coach.
Right.
And because of the racial, the English-French tension of the day, we moved to Ajax. And so, long story short, I ended up playing for the Pickering Panthers under Sherry Basson, who, you know, if you're into hockey, you know Sherry. He did such a wonderful job with the Canadian national team. He was my coach in Pickering. And it was one of probably the most gratifying experience I had as a amateur, because what I found under Sherry's tutelage was that racism wasn't just a Bernie problem. He had this team concept, and so when things happened, under his tutelage, the whole team reacted. There's one story I talk about in the book where we're in Belleville playing the Bobcats in a really important game with playoff implications, and I'm getting racial hatred rained down from the stands, and Sherry stopped the game. He stopped the game and said, "Listen, we're not playing until this person gets thrown out of the rink." And the referee said, "You're going to have to forfeit the game." Coach Basson said, "Nope, we're not playing. We're not playing." And eventually the guy got thrown out of the game. With me, I was a shy, innocent kid, and I'd just be staring down my skate laces, just mortified that the whole game was centered upon me. But once again, people ask, what can others do about racism in hockey? Make it a we problem. It shouldn't just be a me problem. Everybody should get involved.
Absolutely. Great answer, Bernie. Terrific career, as I mentioned, playing college hockey, Western Michigan. Going there and 3 seasons, your final 3 seasons there, 20 goal scorer. You were captain of the team as well. One of your teammates, Neil Smith, who we know through hockey circles as well. Tell us a little bit about your experience playing for WMU back then.
I, like most Canadian, kids of the day, wanted to play major junior A because I saw that as a direct pathway to the NHL, and that's all I wanted to do. But my father was somewhat of an absentee father. But one of the things he did was he insisted that John and I get our education. And so I went to Kingston's camp. I was drafted to the Kingston Canadians. I went to the Blue Blanc Rouge camp, and he pulled me out of both of them. Says, "No, you're going to the States to play college." And so it's probably the best thing for me. I went down there. College hockey was just developing, but we had a great team and a great run. We played against teams like Bowling Green that had players like Kenny Morrow on the team and whatnot. So it was a great experience. I ended up as the all-time leading scorer for the university at the time. But for me, it's just playing hockey. It's just my pathway to the NHL and what I was supposed to do. And so I accomplished all my goals there. But most importantly, I got my education. So I kind of packed myself a parachute.
Fantastic. And just a modest man there, Bernie, but 1994 inducted into the Western Michigan University Athletic Hall of Fame as well. So kudos to you on that. The path there led you to what came next. You joined the Quebec Nordiques. It was a pivotal time because the NHL had just embraced the 4 World Hockey Association teams. So Quebec Nordiques were new to the National Hockey League. You signed as a free agent and joined this fledgling team at this time, but you were playing in the National Hockey League ultimately. And Jacques Demers, who you mentioned a few minutes ago, was the coach of the team. Let's talk a little bit about those early days with the Quebec Nordiques, or at least with the organization.
Yeah, it's kind of interesting because people say you played in the NHL, what a thrill. It was a thrill, but you got to understand it's where I expected to be. It's what I worked at throughout my entire life to achieve that goal. So when I made it there, it just kind of felt naturally. And as I talk about in the book, what happened there is that I did outstanding in the minors, both in Syracuse and in Cincinnati. I was leading the CHL at scoring 1 point and did really well in the AHL as well. And I was one of the top prospects in the Nordics organization. My second year, I go to camp, and because the Le Colisée was under reconstruction, refurbishment, they didn't have a full exhibition schedule. So we had a round robin tournament within the camp. I led the tournament in scoring, and I came in third in points behind only Peter Stastny and Anton Stastny, and just was one of the stars of the camp. And they sent me back to the minors, which was just disheartening. Not blaming that on racism, because stuff happens in people's career. But then to add insult to injury, when they sent me to the minors, they didn't have an AHL affiliate, an AHL team. So they sent me to Halifax to play fourth line on the Voyageurs team. They had Guy Carbonneau and Danny Daou and Craig Laughlin and people like that. And so the three of us from the Nordics basically sat on the fourth line. And so it was a wasted year. And so very frustrating. Again, don't blame things on racism, because just things happen in people's life. But after that year, I would go back to camp. I got sent back to the minors. And I felt like, I've done everything you've asked me. I was one of the leading scorers in the minors, one of the top prospects in the minors. The second year, I sat on the bench. And so I wasn't willing to go play the third year and kind of reprove myself in the minors.
You had mentioned that going to the NHL was something that you had candidly hoped and expected at that point. But I wonder if you can just go back to March 19th and your very first NHL game against the Chicago Blackhawks on the road. Can you remember stepping on the ice for the first time and being able to say truthfully, I'm a National Hockey League player?
Kevin, what a thrill. What a thrill. A moment I'll never forget. It was in the old Chicago Stadium, and the dressing room was behind the Blackhawks net. You walk up these, this steep pitch flight of stairs, and you walk into this room, this huge room with the ruby red seats. Just an absolute amazing experience. My first shot on goal was against Tony Esposito. So it was a dream fulfilled. Unfortunately, the situation was marred with some racism, where I'm not sure if they're joking or whatever, but every time I would go by the Chicago bench, not one person, but several players were yelling the N-word kind of in my wake back and forth. And so I was really frustrated, and I got to tell you, shocked, because I naively believed that once I made it to the NHL, I wouldn't have to deal with such racism, and not only have to deal with it, but I dealt with it in my opening game.
Awful to hear, but a pivotal game, but awful to hear. But as a groundbreaker, a pioneer, you are only the fifth person of color, the fifth Black player to ever skate in the National Hockey League. But you really didn't have the heroes to look up to who had gone before. Prior to our conversation online here, we talked about Willie O'Ree. Wouldn't be somebody in your lexicon at that point, would it, Bernie? You had the Guy Lafleurs, as we mentioned, and players of that sort. All of a sudden, you guys were leading the charge. Can you talk a little bit? Was there a little bit of a community amongst those of you who were of color and playing in the National Hockey League, or did that come later, perhaps?
Yeah, the easy answer is no. And it's one of the things that I think is important in the book, because hockey calls Willie O'Ree the Jackie Robinson of hockey. I love Willie O'Ree, and he deserves all the fame and accolades that he's accumulating. But hockey just did not follow the Jackie Robinson model. When Jackie Robinson played his first games in Major League Baseball, that was a door-opening event, and several Blacks, quickly followed. A couple played that same season. In hockey, Kevin, it was 16 years before the next Black played in the league, and that was Mike Marston in 1974. Bill Riley also played a game in 1974. And so if you translate that to my life, there's no internet, and so there's no knowledge of Willie O'Ree and whatnot. So me and my brother, for most of our formative years playing the game, thought we were the only Blacks that played the game, and vice versa. Everywhere we went, nobody has seen a black player in their life. Now, over time, as you know, as we developed, you'd hear these inklings and that whispers as people say, you know, I think somebody played for the Boston Bruins in 1958. They didn't know his name. And so eventually you started to hear these whispers of Willie O'Ree. But we didn't have basically a model. And what's important about that is, especially when I made it to the pros, is that the visual anomaly I can understand. You know, you have all these white players out there, and all of a sudden there's this black skating around there. You're going to watch that person. And so everywhere I went, you know, I was almost a circus clown because everybody was just focused on me. And I can understand that. I can understand, Kevin, the visual anomaly. But what I don't accept and what I never understood was just the hatred. The curiosity, okay, but why do you have to hate me just because I'm, you know, a black person playing hockey?
Without question, and it confuses us to this very day. You mentioned a few moments ago, so you played 2 seasons with the Quebec Nordique organization. You go down and play with Kalamazoo in the International Hockey League. You have a sensational season, but as you mentioned, you realize at that point that your dream had been achieved, but it wasn't going to continue on that way. And you made a very smart move, an educated man who now decided that if I can't continue in hockey to that end, I might as well move on into a career of some sort. What did you do for a living after that, Bernie?
Yeah, it was a staged approach because actually what happened was when the Nordiques wanted me to play the 3rd year in Fredericton, and Jacques Demers was actually the coach there, and Jacques said to me, Bernie, play with me here, and we'll go back to the NHL together. And I just felt so frustrated. I was frustrated with the organization, one, but two, I just withstood 2 seasons of just total bigotry, just raining down me in almost every arena, and I didn't want to do that again. And so what happened was I asked for a buyout for my NHL contract, which they granted, and then I went back to Kalamazoo just for the sole purpose of getting back to Kalamazoo, which is where Western Michigan University is, right, knowing that if I can get there, I can leverage the Bernie Saunders brand and get a day job type of thing. And that's exactly what happened. One thing I did, I write about this in this book, I put on the back cover, is I was so distraught and disappointed with the way my career gone and the racism that I faced. I felt that because this was my swan song playing in the IHL, I had to do something for myself. I actually raised my fist in the Black Power salute that you put on the screen there. Every time I scored there, nobody picked it up, but that was my silent protest to a game, which I thought was just so cruel against me.
That's a wonderful symbol for sure, and
yeah,
a sad end, but you patted the dirt down, the dirt down at that point, and realized that it was time to move on and go on. You've moved on and written this wonderful book. What prompted you to write the book, Bernie? Was it something that was percolating for a number of years? Was there an incident, as we've read about, that made you stop and think that, you know what, I want to tell my story. It's important that I tell my story. And I should make mention, by the way, the book is called Bernie Saunders, Shut Out, The Game That Did Not Love Me Black. A great title, a poignant title, I guess I should say, and really drives the message home. So, Bernie, let me just go back to that. What prompted you to write the book? And tell me how long it took you to write the book as well.
Yeah, the book was around 3 years in the making. My brother John passed away in 2016, and he wrote a book, and it wasn't finished when he passed away. And so I worked with John Bacon, his co-author, and finished the book for him. And I was kind of lost because John was really one of my centers of gravity, and hockey was one of my centers of gravity. I had lost them both, and so I felt I had to do something for myself. To answer your question specifically, though, and it's almost embarrassing for me to say this, but for me, with all the things that have happened over the last 10 years or whatever, to blacks, the George Floyd thing just, tipped me over. And the funny thing is, or not the funny thing is, but the amazing thing is for me, it was more the Derek Chauvin reaction, because it was almost like he was standing over his prey, and he was proud that he had George Floyd on the ground. And when you're black, you deal with racism almost on a daily basis, especially in the last 5 years for me. And so I think you almost become a little inured to it. You see it so often. But for me, that was a tipping point. And then I also translate that to my hockey lens. And so there's been several incidents that have happened the last 5 years that have really left a bad taste in my mouth. One, for example, was the Keandre Miller Zoom bombing event. I just mentioned that I essentially had my NHL debut ruined because of this racial incident that happened with the Blackhawks. I will never forget that. I'll never forget, of course, my NHL debut, but it was just marred because of the racism they faced on that day. It was almost like a bride enduring rain on her wedding day. Well, Keandre Miller, because of COVID, was being introduced to the Ranger fans through a Zoom event. And if you're not aware, a racist infiltrated the feed and wrote the N-word all over the feed. And so here's this kid that has all this talent, just wants to play the game that he loves. He's worked his entire life for that moment, and he has to deal with that. And so I look at, it's been 40 years since it happened to me, but I feel like, Bernie, if you don't speak out, there's something wrong with it, because you got to try to help somebody. And the nice postscript is I've had a couple of people reach out to me and say that, their son went through something and they read my book and it was touched them and it helped them. I've offered help. But for me, I'm 65 years old, and I feel like it's time, Bernie, just to take a stand and say something.
Well, it's a wonderful book, Bernie. It's a wonderful book. It's a challenging book. It opens our eyes. It's not that we're immune to knowing about this, but when you hear it first person from someone who lived it and had to endure it, it takes on a whole new matter. Enjoyed the book thoroughly. Shutout, The Game That Did Not Love Me Black. Bernie Saunders, written with Barry Meisel. I don't know if I pronounced that properly.
Meisel.
I wasn't sure which way to go. I tried and missed on the first one, but you really did a great job, and I know it's going to help a lot of people, and I know it's going to be under a lot of trees this year. It's a terrific book, and we thank you very much for writing the book, but also for joining us today on Hockey Time Machine, Bernie. Thanks a million. Really been special.
Thanks for having me. Thank you.
Yeah, all right. Good. Wow. That was pretty amazing. Bernie's such a well-spoken gentleman, and he's written a great book. I was fortunate enough to pick it up about a week and a half ago in preparation for Hockey Time Machine, and it's one of those that I didn't want to put down because the story is important and it's current. As much as a lot of Bernie's career took place back many years ago, it's a story that's current today. So we'll go from there. We'll talk about going back a few years. We're going to talk about an event that took place an awfully long time ago. And Tim Falconer is going to join us now. Tim Falconer is the author of a book called Klondikers, Dawson City's Stanley Cup Challenge and How a Nation Fell in Love. And what a book this is. Entirely different from the one that Bernie Saunders has, entirely different than the one that we'll talk about with Danny Jeffrion in a few minutes' time. But this is a great book because it really, to me, is, it takes us to a time, an antiquated time. It's almost like it was an archaeological dig that you did, Tim, and opened up a story here that some of us are somewhat aware of, but if we aren't, it's a pretty special one. And just want to move on from there. So let's talk a little bit about that. So in 1915, the Pacific Hockey Association and the National Hockey Association begin an agreement with the championship of their respective leagues meeting together annually for the Stanley Cup. So that put an end to what we call the challenge situation for hockey at that time, whereby teams could appeal to the Stanley Cup trustees to challenge the current Stanley Cup champion of that time. And that's where we go with this book. It takes us back to 1905. It's the most famous hockey challenge that ever existed. It's the most extraordinary hockey challenge that ever existed as well. And boy, you wrote a wonderful job. Incredibly well researched, Tim. Enjoyed so much of it. I haven't even quite finished it yet, but we're going through it and really, really enjoying it. It's about a team called the Dawson City Nuggets. And if you don't mind, Tim, let me throw it over to you. Maybe you can tell us about Dawson City back in the early 1900s, the early part of the last century, and how they could conceive of having a hockey team that could play against, we'll find out shortly, about the Ottawa Hockey Club, known as the Silver Seven. How could they possibly conceive that they could challenge Ottawa for the Stanley Cup? Tim, maybe take us back to 1905.
Okay, well, first of all, thank you for having me. It's a pleasure to be here. I want to one quick correction, which is that they weren't known as the Nuggets. They were known as the Klondikers, which is why the book is called Klondikers. I thought they were called the Nuggets, but as I did the research for this book, I discovered that a lot of what I thought I knew was not correct. But anyway, to answer your question, well, I think there's a few things. First of all, Weldy Young, who had been a star for the Ottawa Hockey Club and in the 1890s, but then went to Dawson City, and there he is there. He went to Dawson in 1899. There was a big gold rush. The big gold rush summer was the year earlier, but there was still lots of work, and that's why he went. And there was another guy, Randy McLennan, who had played for Queen's University when they challenged for the Cup in 1895. So, and there were other good hockey players from, there's Randy. There were other good hockey players living in Dawson. And so they thought they were good. They were good enough to do it. The other thing I think is that because they were so remote, they didn't realize how much the game had changed in the last few years. In 1899, the Montreal Shamrocks win the Stanley Cup, and they played what they called scientific hockey, which we would now call strategic hockey. And the game was just improving. The players were getting better. The strategies were getting better. And I think in Dawson, they didn't really realize, because there was no TV or radio, and they didn't realize how much better the rest of the country was getting at the game.
Interesting. Wow. Tell us about the role that Joe Boyle played with the Dawson City team as well, Tim.
So Joe Boyle was a mining guy. He actually went up to Dawson in 1897. He was on a boxing tour. He was a boxing manager and boxing promoter, and he ended up in Dawson and became a very successful businessman, mining interest, lumber, and a bunch of other businesses, and a leading member of the community. And the amazing thing is, as early as 1900, in a letter that Weldy Young wrote, he talked about, well, we're going to challenge for the Cup. So as early as 1900, Dawson was talking about challenging for the Cup. And it didn't happen until Joe Boyle became involved. And in the summer of 1904, he delivered a letter written by Weldy Young. He hand-delivered it to P.D. Ross, who was one of the trustees of the Cup. And because Boyle had a lot of experience as a sports promoter, all of a sudden, this idea that people have been talking about for years happened. So that was his role. He's an amazing guy. Like, he is one of the great Canadian heroes that no one's ever heard of. So, because he has an amazing life after this series. He becomes a war hero and the savior of Romania, and
wow,
the paramour of Queen Marie of Romania and whatnot. But that's all after my book.
That'll be the next book. There you go, Tim. Well, I was going to ask, one of the discussion points I had was, it's one thing to dream and want to chase after the Stanley Cup, but for P.D. Ross and the other trustee, I can't remember his name off the top of my head, and I should, but for them to accept the challenge seemed a curious situation as well. You've answered it partly there too. Is there anything more that you can tell us about that, Tim?
Well, there were a couple of problems. I mean, the game was a great success, and my book, I really look at why the subtitle says, and how a nation fell in love with hockey. is because in 1893, when the Cup arrives from England after Stanley has ordered it, the game was kind of a niche regional sport. And when Stanley donates this trophy, all of a sudden the game takes off. And but there were a couple of problems. One was violence, which was from the very beginning a controversial part of the game. Some fans liked it. Lots of people thought it was going to kill the game. And the other one was professionalism. And because officially professionalism wasn't allowed in Canada, a lot of the great players were going down to play in the States where they could play for money. And so there was, I think, a PR element in the reason P.D. Ross approved it. I think also he knew that this team, because the gold rush had made Dawson and the Klondikers so famous, he knew they would sell a lot of tickets. So I think that was a factor. And also he had been a teammate of P.D. Ross, of Weldy Young.
Right.
There was a personal connection there as well. And that's why P.D. Ross wrote a personal letter, saying that he was going to get a great team together and, would be a great challenge. But people were very skeptical that a team from the Yukon could challenge, which was, the first real dynasty, the Ottawa Hockey Club. And, as the Dawson team wasn't known as the Nuggets, they were known as the Klondikers. And the Ottawa team was not known as the Silver Seven yet. That was sort of later on, they got referred to that. But if you read the newspaper articles, and I've read millions of them, they didn't refer to them as Silver Seven yet. They were the Ottawa Hockey Club, or just the Ottawas. Right. But they were an amazing team. They had one-eyed Frank McGee, who I like to consider hockey's first superstar, and just a great all-round team. And they won and defended the Cup 10 straight times. All in 3 years. So they only held the Cup for 3 years, but it's like they won it 10 years in a row, because every time they faced a challenge. One year they faced 4 teams. Wow. They had 4 Stanley Cup series. So there was just no way that, at this point, Weldy Young is 35, they just weren't going to beat Ottawa. But P.D. Ross must have seen this as a good PR move. Wonderful.
So Weldy is 35. He doesn't even get a chance to go to the tournament. But I want to talk about somebody else who intrigues me, and that's a 17-year-old goalie, Albert Forrest. What can you tell me about Albert?
Well, he was 18 when they left, and he turned 19 before he played. So 17 isn't quite correct. Sorry to keep. I apologize.
I'm glad that's what historians are all about, and there's so many of us on this podcast. I'm so glad that you are. You're helping me out immensely here.
Well, the thing is, as I say, I went into this thinking I knew a little bit about this series, and then I got into research and I realized so much of what I thought I knew was wrong. Anyway, so he actually wasn't a goalie. He had played, I saw one reference to a game in Dawson where he played as a goalie, but he was a really, really good athlete, as were his brothers, and he was a forward. But because the best goaltender in town was the gold commissioner, and he wasn't going to leave for 3 months to, leave his job. Yeah. Albert Forrest said, okay, well, I'll play net. And so this seemed to be another weakness for the team, I would say. An inexperienced, but a very good athlete, but an inexperienced goaltender.
Very good. Well, the trip itself, let's reel it in just for a moment. So many of us, by way of Thanksgiving or the upcoming holidays, will do some traveling. And some will cross the nation one way or another, or head south. But there is nothing like the traverse that the Klondikers had to make in order to play. Going from Dawson City to Ottawa was no mean feat. It's not easy now, but it was no mean feat back then either. 6,400 kilometers, 4,000 miles in rough terms to get from Dawson City down to Ottawa. Maybe you can sketch out a little bit, Tim, if you don't mind, the the actual path that it entailed for the team to get to Ottawa to engage in the Stanley Cup Challenge.
Okay, I'm going to correct you again because they actually, well, I'll get to this in a minute, but they actually went through Seattle. So the first part of the trip was from Dawson to Whitehorse, which was 330 miles, 500 kilometers. And most people think they took dog sleds. They did not take dog sleds. First of all, there wasn't enough snow. But also they had planned to walk. Weldy Young had written letters, to P.D. Ross and to his father. He was saying, we're going to walk to keep us in shape, to get us in shape and keep us in shape. This didn't make a lot of sense to me because it was going to take a lot longer than taking a stagecoach or a sleigh, which would be half the time. And he said, well, the stagecoaches, you get bounced around and it wouldn't be good for us. I personally think it was to save money because it would have been $125 per guy to take that. So in December, one day, 3 players left on foot. The next day, 4 left on bikes. And I've walked a bit of the Overland Trail, which is what they took. And it is up and down and curvy. And it would not be an easy trip in the middle of the summer. In the winter. And it wasn't too cold when they started, but then the temperature plunged. And then it started to snow before they got to Whitehorse. All the bikes broke down, so those guys ended up walking as well. And the only equipment they took were their skates, and so they carried everything on their backs. And so they get to Whitehorse 2 days after Christmas. And there had been so much snow the last couple of days that the narrow gauge train from Whitehorse to Skagway, which is only about 110 miles, I think, it was closed. So they were delayed and they couldn't get to Skagway. They actually wired the captain of the Amur, which was the steamer they were supposed to take to Vancouver, and asked it to wait. The captain waited for 24 hours and then left 2 hours before the train finally arrived in Skagway. So they're stuck in Skagway, and they could have used this time to maybe do some practicing. But Skagway had a rink, but it was half sand, so it just dulled their skates. So they didn't do that. Apparently, they dove in the Skagway River every day to keep them in shape. But there's also a rumor that, and I know some of the guys on the team were not drinkers, but there was a rumor that they were in heavy liver training in Skagway. So this is not doing wonders for their conditioning. They finally get on the Dolphin and take it to Seattle, not Vancouver, which is why I was correcting you on your map. And then they had to take a train up to Vancouver, and then they take the train, the transcontinental, across Canada. They arrive in Ottawa after 3.5 weeks of travel. And it's 48 hours before the first game. And Ottawa has already delayed the series, and they say they're not going to delay it anymore. And so they didn't have a lot of time to get back in shape after not being on ice for 3.5 weeks. And the first game does not go well.
Well, tell us about, so we're in Days Arena in Ottawa, Ontario. It's January 13th. Weldy Young not on the squad for the Klondikers at this point. Tell us about that first game, Tim.
It starts off okay. The first 20 minutes, it looks like Dawson can keep up with Ottawa. But they lose 9-2. And they think, okay, well, we were tired. We were out of shape. We'll get the next time. Now, interestingly, there was an incident after the game in the bar where someone, probably Joe Boyle, says, well, this Frank McGee's he's no great scorer because he'd only scored one goal. So, the expression bulletin board material? This was perhaps the most powerful bulletin board material ever, because in game 2, one-eyed Frank McGee scores 14 goals. And
Tim, imagine if he had 2 eyes. It would have been crazy. 14 goals. Wow.
And at one point, he scores 8 in a row. Jeez. It's just... so, yeah, they get... even after they've had a couple of days rest and practice, and Joe Boyle is, talking to the media saying, the media, there was only newspapers then, but, he's saying, we're ready. And it does not go well, 23-2. And Albert Forrest is the best player for the Klondikers.
Jeez, that answers a few questions, Tim. One of the people writing about that game mentioned that it was as one-sided as a firing squad. Boy, oh boy, there we go. Well, it was a best-of-3 tournament. That answered the questions right there. 2 losses in a row. So the tournament is over, and Ottawa Hockey Club wins the Stanley Cup, or at least retains the Stanley Cup at that point. But the boys now need to go back home. And they played a series of exhibition games. One of the things I was curious about, Tim, was that to help finance their trip back, or was it just for the sake that we're on the eastern part of Canada now? Let's play some more hockey while we're here. Maybe you can tell me a little bit about that.
I think it was both. I definitely, they wanted to make some money to pay for their trip home. And these kind of barnstorming tours for fun and money were common. So they'd set up these games, or a lot of them, not all of them, but a lot of them before they even left. And in a lot of the places they played, they were a great draw. And there were some smaller towns where they didn't draw too well because the prices were a bit high. But in general, they were very well received, and they did pretty well. They won 10 and lost 12. So they showed that they could play with Eastern hockey players, just not with the best team in the world, the Ottawa Hockey Club.
Boy, oh boy. So on the way back now, a couple of the boys find out, or maybe it was even earlier than that, a couple of the boys find out that they no longer have jobs when they return to Dawson City.
Yeah, that was the morning before their second Stanley Cup game.
As if they hadn't been kicked enough while they were down. My goodness. Yeah. Oh, boy. Well, you have researched and written an extraordinary book, Tim. You did a great job. The footnotes were almost as exciting as the narrative itself. Really a strong book called Klondikers, Dawson City's Stanley Cup Challenge, and How a Nation Fell in Love with Hockey. And it is a great book about an era that few of us know very much about. And it really, really was a compelling read. And I'm anxious to finish it off. Sadly, I'll finish it off tonight after we've spoken, Tim. But it's just a great, great book. Really job well done.
Thank you, Kevin.
Tell us about how long it took you to write that book, Tim.
It came out 2 months ago, and I started working on it in 2016. So it took a long time, and visits to a lot of archives, and a lot of looking through old newspapers, some of which are now online, which is great, but also just going to libraries and putting a reel in a machine and going blind, looking at newspapers, and so it was a lot of work, but it was sometimes frustrating because there would be stuff that I wanted to be there that wasn't there. But then when you would find something that you hadn't seen anyone else had mentioned before, it was yes, it was very exhilarating in that situation.
Wonderful stuff. Available widely, ECW, your publisher, and have done a great job publicizing it, but also marketing it as well. One more time, Klondikers. Let me get that subtitle right. Klondikers, Dawson City's Stanley Cup Challenge, and How a Nation Fell in Love with Hockey by Tim Falconer. Tim, thank you very, very much for joining us today.
Thank you, Kevin.
All right.
I enjoyed that.
Very good. Well, we've talked to Bernie Saunders with one aspect of hockey, Tim Falconer about another aspect of hockey, and we've got a third aspect now that we want to bring to the fore, and this one's a little different as well, a little different than the other two too. And this one involves a family. Now, there have been some great families in hockey, and we'll talk about it in our conversation, but this is a really, really special family who put 4 generations of players into the National Hockey League, all 4 having played or spent some time with the Montreal Canadiens. Now I want to introduce you to Danny Jeffrion. Through hockey's amazing history, there have been a number of multi-generational families. Let's think about the Klondikers family, for example. So we had Lionel, we had Charlie, and we had Roy, all who went to the Hockey Hall of Fame. And then Lionel's son, Brian, played in the National Hockey League as well. Pretty storied family. The Patrick family was considered the royal family of hockey as well. I thought about it and came up with a family that had 3 generations. There was the Hextalls. We had Brian Hextall, who played with the New York Rangers in the 30s and 40s, his son Dennis, and Dennis's son Ron, who was a goaltender with, among other teams, the Philadelphia Flyers. So 3 generations is pretty extraordinary, but there's nothing like you're going to hear next as we talk to Danny Jeffrion and his new book, along with Paul Deepan, called To Hold It High, 4 generations of hockey's most storied franchise. So we welcome the gentleman here and going to get into the whole history of the Jeffrion family, their immortality, and how this book came to be as well. So Danny, let me take you back to 1958. If I can set the stage, your father, Bernie Jeffrion, Bernie Boom Boom, was in the midst of something quite extraordinary. He was in the midst of winning 5 consecutive Stanley Cup championships, never to be equaled in hockey history to this date. Here he was. He later went on to score 50 goals in a season, the second NHL player to do exactly that. And here's baby Danny arriving on the scene just around that time. What I want to ask, when did it become obvious to you that you were part of something pretty special here and that your dad was quite a famous hockey player, Danny?
Well, that's a tough one, but probably as far back as I can think and quickly here is when Dad made his comeback in 1968. We were in New York. I think I was like 11 years old, and Dad was coming out of the dressing room. My brother and I, Bob, and my sister Linda and Mom, we were waiting in the car for him, and Mom sent us off to go get Dad because Dad had pulled up a chair and he was signing autographs, for all the Ranger fans. And so my brother and I weaved our way through the crowd and came up, to Dad on the chair and said, "Dad, Mom said that, you gotta go. We gotta go home." And my dad said, "Hey, go back to the car and tell your mom that these are my fans and we're not leaving until they all have an autograph." So that's kind of like it hit me because I think it took me 3 times the amount of time to get back to the car because of all the fans that had showed up. So that was probably the first inclination that I had that, hey, who is this guy? He's a pretty famous guy.
Pretty amazing story. And what a great ambassador for the game as well. As a young boy, did you ever play with some of the other children of the players, either in Montreal or in New York, just playing mini sticks or whatever it happened to be?
Yeah. So when we were young, probably not so much Montreal because we were very young. But I do remember they always had like a Christmas party every year for the Montreal Canadiens. And so that's when we intertwine a lot with some of the other kids. But I do remember in New York, again, going back to New York, because you have to remember that was 68. So I was 11 years old, 11, 12 years old. There was the Phil Goyette's family was there, but primarily my brother and I probably were good friends with Emil Francis kids, Ricky Francis and Bobby Francis. We even played youth hockey together in New York when it was all starting to get going. So yeah, throughout the years we've run into people here and there and some of the other kids and once in a while, we would reflect back on when was the last time we saw each other, and it's pretty amazing that there was quite a few.
Well, okay, so let's step it back even further now. When did you become aware of the fact that your grandfather was Howie Morenz, who was an extraordinary hockey player as well? Although he didn't come from the Jeffrion stream of things, he was your mom's father. Tell us about when you might have learned about Howie Morenz.
Right. Well, that all came from Mom. He died at a very young age. I believe it was 32, Paul, something like that. I can't recall exactly.
He was 37.
Yeah, 37. And so, my mom, I think, was only 6, 7 years old. And so it was pretty cool because, she had sat us down and told us, about, her figure skating and who her dad was. And, it was quite the surprise and very interesting.
Pardon me. He died in 1937, but he was 33 years old.
Okay.
He was a really young man.
So there you have it.
Got it. Very good. Well, so with the Morenz line, the Jeffrion line, how did that impact on you as a young boy playing hockey? Clearly you had some skills, Danny. You were able to do very well, and we'll talk about a few moments' time. But how did that impact on you? Was it something that the other kids and the families of other kids as well brought to the fore?
Well, just looking back, you would think that would be a lot of pressure on somebody growing up and all that, and it really wasn't. We just thought that we were just other kids, That all started kicking in probably when we started playing much more competitive hockey, probably like Bantam and midget. And then it really made a lot of sense once, we turned and played junior hockey in Cornwall, Ontario, where I played all of my junior hockey. So there it was always, Danny Jeffrion and the Cornwall Royals, or Bob Jeffrion and Danny Jeffrion and the Cornwall Royals. So you can kind of feel it there a little bit more, that all the eyeballs were on Danny and Bob, to see like, well, are they going to be like their dad? So there was always that pressure. And my answer to that was always, there's only going to be one Boom Boom Jeffrion, so stop comparing. So at the end of the day, it was good. It kind of like got you jacked up for every game because you wanted to do well because of your name, But yeah, it did bring on a lot of pressure. But then at other times, whenever you were going to a restaurant later on and it was booked solid pretty good, it got you in if you just mentioned the name. So there's always a good and a bad for everything.
Well, okay, let's go look at Cornwall for a second. You're playing junior hockey, major junior hockey with the Cornwall Royals, wearing Dad's number 5 too, which maybe added pressure or maybe was just a wonderful tribute to your father as well. 5 seasons in Cornwall. Let me think. 33 goals, 42 goals, 39 goals. What a phenomenal junior career. And the Jeffrion lineage continues on hockey-wise. Had to people to the rink to watch you play. Certainly, the journalists would pick up on your lineage as well. Can you talk about your time playing major junior hockey, Danny?
Yeah, that was probably the best part of my life. The saddest thing is, it was that, my brother and I both left home at the age of 14. So I ended up going to Cornwall when I was 14 years old, stayed with the Billet family, Mr. and Madame Blais in Cornwall, and super nice family, and had a great time in Cornwall, played 5 years. We were an Ontario team playing in the Quebec League, and just had some great times, some great stories. This is, where I was a teenager, and Cornwall was very supportive of our teams year after year. Funny story, because there is a Royals website, and all these guys were bragging on Dale Hawerchuk and Dave Gilmore, and all the goals and assists that they had. And I said, hey guys, you need to look a little deeper. I'm the top scorer, the most goals, the most assists, the most penalty minutes, the most games. So I was hoping that nobody would catch this, but they said, yeah, but Danny, you played 5 years. They only played 3. And I said, well, that doesn't count.
Exactly.
What a great story to input here is that Paul, at the time of my career, was living in Cornwall.
Mm-hmm.
And I did not even know him. He used to come probably just about every game. He wasn't a guy to come and bother the players, I guess, afterwards, but he never came for an intro or anything. What ended up happening, which is just crazy, is that, I was at the rink, and Paul's wife, Lori, was playing goal, and I was playing against her in some kind of game, and so when she got home, she told Paul, she goes, I ran into Danny Jeffrion today. And so, Paul said, no way. And so, long story short, that's when we hooked up, had a cup of coffee, and we said, hey, why don't we write a book? Paul had a great thought.
Fantastic. Let's put that on the back burner just for a moment here. We'll come back in just a moment. You turned pro with the Quebec Nordique Association during the last year of that league's existence before you headed into Montreal, claimed by the Montreal Canadiens at that point, and you joined the team in 1979-80. So here we are now, Howie Morenz, Montreal Canadiens, Bernard Jeffrion, Montreal Canadiens, now all of a sudden a third generation playing with the Montreal Canadiens, which is very much what To Hold It High, your book, is all about as well. But you not only played with the team, you were coached by your father at that time too. Tell us a little bit about your experiences during that 1979-80 season, Danny.
Yeah, that was a lot of fun. So I'll make this as, we have limited time here. So what ended up happening is, right out of the gate, I was drafted by Montreal Canadiens. Always wanted to play for the Montreal Canadiens. And then I get drafted by the Quebec Nordiques also. And the Quebec Nordiques came after me pretty aggressively with a nice compensation program. But I think for me, it wasn't just about the money, even though my dad was always saying, take the cash, Danny, take the cash. Right? To me, it was, I was sitting there in Atlanta that summer because we would only get home 2 months out of the summer. And I was reading the hockey news, and I went down on the right wing side of the Montreal Canadiens. Yet Guy Lafleur, Mario Tremblay, Mark Napier, Rick Chartres, who was on that great defensive line with Bob Gainey and Doug Jarvis. And I said to myself, gosh, you are headed to Nova Scotia, and you're going to be eating lobster for a couple of years. And if funny thing there is that whenever I watch Hockey Night in Canada, whenever I could with my billet dad, Mr. Blett, they would always put down Nova Scotia. Time after time. Oh, if you get sent down to the minors, you're going to the you-know-what of the world, then there's nothing there. And that was part of my decision making whenever they tried to send me down to, when they left it up to me to be sent down to Nova Scotia. All I can think about is all these guys on Hockey Night in Canada saying how terrible Nova Scotia was, until I ended up at one time in the American League and we played against Nova Scotia, and I loved the place. It was beautiful. And yeah, the lobster was pretty good too. But again, speeding through this, we have this part could be an hour, but yeah, probably the toughest thing was with Dad, only because I didn't know my dad. I only hung out with him for 2 months out of the summer for 5 years in the most important time of my life. It wasn't back then like they could drive to the games. They were in Atlanta. He was coaching the Flames. It was like a long distance relationship. It was very difficult, but we were goal driven, and all I wanted was to make the NHL. So when I got to Montreal, and then 10 days before training camp, when he sits me down and he goes, Danny, he goes, you're going to Montreal. He goes, if you don't want me to do this, I won't do this. I promise you. He goes, but Montreal just offered me the coaching job. I would be the first guy, if we win the Stanley Cup, to win the Stanley Cup as a player and as a coach. Wow. This has been one of my dreams of my life. Like, what was I supposed to say? No, you're done. You're staying in Atlanta there, Dad. There goes that dream. So off to Montreal we went. And of course it was tough because we didn't know each other. I mean, I love my dad, but we had no relationship. And that, came to fruition. Is that the word? Yeah. That when my career was over, we basically became, best of friends. But funny thing, we never talked about our time in Montreal, and I was cool with it because I had closure. But it was very difficult because I was too preoccupied being the clown of the team and making the guys laugh, making sure that they didn't think that I was that guy, who tattletales back to Dad. Maybe they weren't even thinking that, but that's how it was all in my head. So bad that I was so preoccupied about that I forgot to play hockey. So from there, it took me on to, being unprotected, and I went to the Winnipeg Jets, and my career continued with the Jets, and then Tulsa of the Central League, and then Sherbrooke of the American League. And then I finally became the biggest player on the ice when I went to Japan.
I wanted to ask about that experience. It's not a hockey market that we think of right now. Certainly at that time you didn't. Today we do a little bit more so. Tell us about playing in Japan in 83, 84.
Oh, it was great. There was one other gentleman there, another player, Francois James, that I played against him in junior hockey. So it was him and I together on that team. We were allowed 2 foreign players, and it was 5 teams, and you basically, it was like baseball. We were in Sapporo. There's a team in Kushiro. There was a team in Tokyo. A couple of other big cities, and we would just travel around, like baseball, and play like against each other every weekend in all these different cities. But it was a league. It was great. It was a great experience. My oldest son, Nick, was actually born in Japan. But I always tell him, I go, don't worry, you weren't made in Japan. You were only born in Japan. And so we had a great time. It was like, the caliber of hockey was probably like junior B, and the goaltending wasn't that strong. But it was a wonderful experience. The Japanese people were fantastic. The best advice that I got was from our interpreter, where he said, with the Japanese people, all that you have to do is just try their ways. You don't have to like it. Like, for example, the food, just try. if they see you trying, they will love that and respect you, that much more. So there's a couple of other good stories there, but like I said, we might want to do a 5-hour episode next time.
I wish we could. This has been wonderful.
Yeah.
Well, so we've talked about 3 generations, which is quite amazing at this point. We've talked about Howie Morenz, Bernard Jeffrion, Danny Jeffrion, but we talk about a 4th generation and to hold it high, and that's your son Blake, who started off with the Nashville Predators, but Montreal Canadiens too. What a story. And that's exactly what the book is all about as well. Tell us a tiny bit about Blake, and then we'll get into the nuts and bolts of creating this book with Paul.
Right. So, Blake was born here in Nashville, Tennessee, which is unbelievable, and he went, all my boys did all their hockey here and all that. But what would happen back then, we've been here 32 years. So what would happen then when they were done basically with Bantam first year midget, there was no high school hockey, which is very popular in the U.S. So luckily for us, they got recruited by Culver Academies up in northern Indiana. All the boys did, except for my oldest one, Nick. He had kind of like discontinued his hockey career just because there was a lack of ice and lack of high school hockey. All about the breaks, right? Yeah. And so Blake went on to, Culver Academies. He went on to be national team development program for Team USA, won the 18 and over tournament. I think it was Finland or Sweden. We've got the picture upstairs, and the world tournament, and then gets drafted by the Nashville Predators locally right here, which was great. And then what ends up happening, which I still think till this day it was politically driven. I mean, Blake was really starting to come on. He was always a late bloomer, but I think what happened is that in Montreal they were having issues, with winning like they are now, and that the coach couldn't even talk to the press because he couldn't speak French. So that became a big problem over there as they were losing. And then the Predators were making a big move, first chance possibly to get into the playoffs, and they were small on the D. And so the trade occurred between Montreal Canadiens, Blake Jeffrion to the Montreal Canadiens for Hal Gill, who's a big
6'7"
big guy. He's only 6'7". He shook my hand not too long ago. Funny story, because I said to him, I go, he didn't know who I was. And he was doing he was at the end of his little speech, and I do little hockey tournaments on the side. And out of the blue, I just said to him, I go, hey, Hal, you owe me a lot of money. Like, he didn't know how to react. I go, you owe me a lot of money. He was like, what are you talking about? And I go, I'm Blake Jeffrion's son. When he got traded, that took date night away from me and my wife because we were getting his 2 tickets. We would do dinner, 2 tickets, and a hockey game. Now that's gone. So anyway, so that's how Blake ended up in Montreal. And, all of the attention of the non-French speaking coach went away, and it was all about, Boom Boom Jeffrion's grandson.
Right. Well, it's extraordinary that not only Asians play in the National Hockey League, but all 4 wore the flannel, the red, white, and blue Montreal Canadiens. Amazing. To hold it high, 4 generations of hockey's most storied franchise by Danny Jeffrion and Paul Deepan. Paul, tell me about sitting down with Danny, whether it be by phone or in person or whatever it was, and putting the story together and how it all came to be. I understand that you had the Cornwall connection, but when you actually sat down to put the book together.
So obviously many years went by between us mutually living in Cornwall and the strange twists of fate that brought us both to Brentwood, Tennessee. And my son played high school hockey, and one of the other parents mentioned that he knew the Jeffrions, and that was the first I knew that Danny now lived about 1.5 miles away from my house. So my wife, I think, as he mentioned before, is very involved in women's hockey here, and Danny wanted to add a women's team component to his tournaments that he ran, and he was trying to get together with my wife because she would go and play in tournaments all over the place, and he felt she could promote it for him. And their schedules never met. So I became the point person. I was voluntold by my wife to go and meet Danny. And so that's how we met. We met in a parking lot in a Waffle House on a pretty hot day. And Danny's wife drives by and sees him talking to this strange guy she's never laid eyes on before. Pulls up and he goes, "Hey, this is my boyfriend, Paul. I want you to meet him." So that's how we met. But we had that immediate connection, you know, because we shared that Cornwall experience and we knew what it was like to be expatriate Canadians living in the South. Lots of little things that are subtle. So we understood each other, I think, very early on. And when I said to Danny, look, your family played 4 generations, not only in the same pro sport, but the same pro team.
Right.
There's a story there. And at first he was reluctant because he was saying, you know, anyone can look up, Google me, whatever, my dad, all of our stuff is public domain. It's not any secret. I said, yeah, but the really interesting part of this story is what happened off the ice and not just what happened on the ice.
Yeah, I think also what was really special is that right from the get-go, you know, Paul and I, we said, no, you know, Paul has written quite a few other books. And so I told him, I go, I just don't want a timeline on this. It's like, it has to be done in 6 months. I think it took us, what, 4 years?
A couple of years, yeah.
That's a lot of cups of coffee. You know, we would just meet at Panera Bread, and of course I would be doing the talking. So, you know, as you can see, the authors are Danny, Jeffrion, and Paul. Well, it's Paul. For the people who are going to read the book, they're going to see how good of a writer that he is. I was just telling my stories. It's not a very long book. I mean, I even read it, and the whole thing what's great about this book is that it flows nicely, and there's the book could have been 1,000 pages.
Yeah,
sure. Could have been so many more stories.
The narrative challenge really was culling out so many stories that we could have included that we just didn't have space for.
There was a few stories in there that even the guys that I play hockey with now here in the beer league, they said, "Dang, why don't you say that story? Why don't you say this story and all that you tell us whenever we go for a beer after hockey and all that?" And I told the guys, "Hey guys, my dad one time told me like this, you know, with his French accent. He goes, Danny, maybe one day you decide to write the book. Be careful what you put in the book about other people." And I said to him, I go, "Well, why is that?" He goes, "Because maybe one day those people will write a book and say a few things about you." So
yeah, we tried to be very respectful, obviously, to everybody that we wrote about. And as I said, there were tons of stories that we had to just not include.
Sure. You know, the thing is, Kevin, like before we leave this podcast and all that, like one thing that I certainly wanted to say is that it's not just like what Paul, I think, does so great about it is that he doesn't just talk to you about hockey and Howie Morenz and Boom Boom and Danny and Blake, but also what's going on in the world during that time, which is so interesting. I mean, I don't like history. I probably didn't do very good in my history class. But the thing is that it really makes it interesting. So there's a lot of good stuff in there that I had, you know, his research was really good, and I had no idea. But I think probably what surprised Paul and I one time is, without mentioning any names, is that we self-published this book, and we had a publisher potentially in the province of Quebec that was going to, you know, publish it for us, you know, in Quebec, so that we can do the French translation, so on and so forth. And he read the book quite rapidly. Really nice guy, young man. Again, I'm not gonna mention any names, but he came back and he said, Danny, it's a great book. It's well written and all that. But you know what? When we talked about it, he really, he goes, not to put you down, which he did, right? Was like, he goes like, your son and you were not in the same category as Howie Morenz and Boom and your dad Boom Boom. Oh, really? Like, we didn't know that? Yeah. So what was so disappointing, here's a guy who's a professional that does this for a living. He didn't catch what this book was about. This book is about like leadership. It's about that in life, it has the formula of success in it, that in life, you have to work hard. You have to sacrifice. You what's the other word that I'm missing? You have to work hard. You have to sacrifice. You have to give things up.
Get a little lucky. And that's the thing you can have all the skill in the world and all the effort and be very coachable, have great puck sense, all of that stuff. But if the politics, the thing that fascinated me was how Quebecois and Canadian politics at the time affected Danny's progress in his career, in his profession. It also affected what happened with Boom Boom. And there were politics, and not just larger national politics, but also in the room, in the locker room type of politics, and relationships between coaches and players, and how prior relationships with Boom Boom may have impacted the development of his son and his grandson. And all of that is in there. And that was what we were really trying to inform people about.
Yeah. And it's like, that's what I wanted to make sure that we tell everybody that's not just a boring hockey book. It just, it's the formula of success. It's like, I had a great junior hockey career. Everything was great and all that. And it seems that once I got drafted and turned pro, that it was kind of like downhill from there. Again, not making excuses. Some of it was my fault. Some of it was all up here. But at the end of the day, what did I learn all those years? The formula to success: work hard, sacrifice. You don't go to that Friday prom dance. You hit the road and you go play a hockey game. So it's just like, I've been a successful businessman since hockey. And where does that formula come from? Work hard, apply yourself, sacrifice. It's all the same thing, So that's what this book was about. And some people didn't that were publishers didn't get it. So there you have it.
Terrific. Well, really looking forward to talking about it a little bit more and to reading it. Santa Claus, please. Where can we get hold of To Hold It High? You mentioned you self-published it. How do we get hold of this book?
So in Canada, it's available on Amazon.ca. Right. It is unfortunately right now only available in English, but we are trying to work to get a French translation done.
Yeah. And here in the States, it's Amazon.com. Just go under books and it's all right there. I think it's going for right now it's $9.99 or $10, something like that. And we're getting ready to raise the price by maybe a couple of bucks here in the next couple of months, but we're going to include an audio so that, people that do a little bit of driving for their kids from one town to the other, they'll be able to read Hold It High.
Wonderful. To Hold It High, 4 generations of hockey's most storied franchise. What a story. And what a storyteller. And what a co-author you are, Paul, as well. By Danny Jeffrion and Paul Deepan. And we thank you so much for being part of Hockey Time Machine today. Thank you guys very, very much.
Thanks, Kevin.
And that interview was taped earlier this week. No, I didn't change my clothes over the last 20 minutes or so. There we go. Well, it's been quite an evening. Every year brings a hockey sock full of new hockey books to make us laugh, make us think, make us remember. And we touched on those 3 with the 3 books that we had today. I want to thank Bernie Saunders and the team at HarperCollins for Shut Out, the game that did not love me black, the game that did not love me black. Tim Falconer and his team at ECW with the book Klondikers, Dawson City's Stanley Cup Challenge, and How a Nation Fell in Love with Hockey. And as you just heard, Danny Jeffrion and his co-author, Paul Deepan, To Hold It High, 4 generations of hockey's most storied franchise. So I implore you to add those books, 1, all, whatever, to your wish list. You won't be disappointed. I've been really, really entertained by all 3 but in all different ways. So while I close things off for this portion of the program, I don't want you to forget that after we close things off, there's the after party, and Paul Patskow and Laura Evans will take care of that as well. My thanks to both them, Paul and Laura, for inviting me back. I've enjoyed a long friendship with both of them and look forward to moving into 2022 with both of them and as friends as well. And a newer friend who I just met when the gang came up to the weekend a couple of weeks ago, but somebody who I've worked with really closely and I really respect. What a great job that he does. It's producer Glenn Dreyfus. The pictures, the video that we see on the screen is so much a part of Hockey Time Machine, and really appreciate that so much, Glenn, and really appreciate your friendship as well. I want to thank all of you for joining us this evening too. And if I don't see you on social media, I want to wish you all a wonderful, safe holiday. Thank you very much for joining this portion of Hockey Time Machine and the Authors Program with 3 wonderful new books. Thanks, everybody.